Welcome to Future Squared, the podcast all about corporate innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-empowerment. Future Squared brings you a double dose of innovation inspiration every week to help you and your company stay relevant in an era of rapid change and 10x your results in both your professional and personal life. Each week, I'll bring you corporate innovators, entrepreneurs, authors, keynote speakers, and thought leaders such as Steve Blank, David Allen, Brad Feld, Tim Harford, Karen Dillon, Jenny Blake, Neil Patel, Rand Fishkin, Pascal Finette, Ryan Blair, and Ash Moria, to name just a few. While every Friday, I'll bring you Fast Fix Friday, some quick, digestible insights to help you end your week on a high as you head off for the weekend. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation hub school and consultancy based in Melbourne, Australia and Singapore that works with companies to help them adopt the mindset, methods and tools to navigate change and survive and thrive in an era of rapid disruption. If your organization needs help coming up with ideas, testing and turning ideas into reality, incubating teams, driving cultural change, or connecting and partnering with startups, then visit www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast. Before we kick off today's episode, I just wanted to correct myself. At one point in today's conversation, I say that the range for a Tesla Model S is between 250 and 300 Ks. It's actually 399 to 613 Ks. Now to today's guest. Welcome back to Future Squared, and today we welcome back Evangelos Simoudis, a recognized expert on big data strategies and corporate innovation. Evangelos first joined us in episode 20 of Future Squared when we discussed corporate VCs, incubators, and startup acquisitions. He's been working in Silicon Valley for 25 years as a venture investor, entrepreneur, and corporate executive. Evangelos is the co-founder and managing director of Synapse Partners, a venture firm that invests in early-stage startups developing big data applications, and is an advisor to global corporations on big data strategies and startup-driven innovation. Since last chatting with Evangelos, he's penned and released a new book called The Big Data Opportunity in Our Driverless Future. The book explores the magnitude, extent, and timing of the disruption that autonomous vehicles will bring, the role that data will play in enabling the next generation of mobility, and how both startups and corporates can position themselves to take advantage of the emerging opportunities. So with that, it gives me much pleasure to welcome back to the show the one, the only Evangelos Simoudis. Welcome to the show, Evangelos.
Very happy to be here again.
Steve. It's great to have you back on the program. It's been about almost a year since we last spoke, and I know you were one of the first few guests on the program, and we've since interviewed many more up to episode 122 now. So definitely excited to have one of our sort of, I suppose, shall we say, freshman guests on the show back.
Freshman and alumni, yes.
Definitely. So it sounds like you've been busy over the past year. Can you tell our audience a bit about what you've been working on since we last spoke? When we last spoke, it was all about corporate VCs, incubators, accelerators, some of the work you were working on with Steve Blank. But you've been very busy since then, and you've also recently put pen to paper on a book. So what can you tell us about that?
So over the past 3.5-4 years, I've been spending a lot of time thinking and writing and working on how corporations work with startups and the startup ecosystems. And that indeed brought me together with Steve Blank, and we did some collaborative work together. But over the past couple of years, I've been also spending quite a bit of time trying to understand the impact that startups will have, particularly on the automotive and transportation industries. And there's a lot of talk about this with autonomous vehicles, with mobility services such as Uber and Lyft and Didi. So I started looking into that topic, and finally last April, May, after having written a couple of blog posts, I thought it warranted a much longer and more expansive treating, and so I started writing, and out came this book, which is not voluminous, but still gets to the point, and I hope it is of value to particularly to business strategists.
Definitely, and the book is called "The Big Data Opportunity in Our Driverless Future," and it came out last month, and it essentially explores the magnitude, extent, and timing of disruption that autonomous vehicles will bring, and the opportunities for both large companies and startups to position themselves to take advantage of this imminent change. And I guess before we go into some of those opportunities, you've identified a number of different drivers in this book, which I definitely recommend people check out. While it's not voluminous, it's very much on point, and you've identified 4 key drivers: urbanization, pollution, climate change, and employment. So what can you tell us about some of those?
So again, the point is that while a lot of us think about technology and the advances in technology, I think with regards to mobility in particular and autonomous vehicles, we have a number of these macro trends. I think that urbanization, particularly megacities, play a big role because they bring problems such as traffic congestion. We spend a lot of time in traffic, particularly, as I said, in large urban environments. And by the time we get to work, we tend to be not in a position to be very productive. Similarly, on the way back, when we spend a lot of time commuting, we don't give our best selves to our families. We also have, pollution and climate change contributes very greatly to some of the ills that we're seeing around megacities. I think in Asia in particular, we see some of these problems, but also even in Europe. You look at cities like Paris and London. We tend to think of Beijing, for example, in Asia, but Paris and London have bad pollution problems. So anyway, the point is that we need to start rethinking the way we move around and the transportation experiences that we have. And I felt that autonomous, connected and electrified vehicles, the ACE vehicles, as I said, combined with mobility services, offer an interesting solution to some of these problems. So I set off to write the book, and in the process, I felt that in these two, as we have these two areas, the macro trends and the technology trends, data is a very important glue. So that's what the book is trying to put forward, that we need these transportation experiences in order to deal with some of the issues that these macro issues that we're experiencing, and we need to execute a number of shifts, and data is important in that frame.
Yeah. So you mentioned that autonomous vehicles, mobility services can help to counter some of these challenges around, people spending an hour and a half on a commute, and by the time they get to work, they're not very productive or effective. Pollution, obviously, if we move to electrify vehicles, then that obviously solves that problem. But in what ways do you see mobility services, autonomous vehicles, helping to counter some of these challenges?
Yeah, so I feel that the combination of the two will lead us to 3 important shifts. So the first shift is really a consumer shift. I believe that we will need to start shifting from a car ownership-centric model to a hybrid model that combines car ownership with on-demand car access, or maybe vehicle access. That's starting now to take hold in cities, or especially certain cities, and particularly in certain segments of the population. but I see that expanding to more broadly around the world. The second shift is the one that the automotive industry itself will need to make. The industry will need to shift from designing and manufacturing vehicles, right, which is and distributing them, to providing transportation solutions. And in order to provide these transportation solutions, they need to get into the customer insights business. In other words, they need to understand the consumers in ways that they have never had to understand before, because the dealers were in between the manufacturer of the vehicle and the user of the vehicle. And the third shift that I believe we will need to see is that in mobility services. So today, I feel that we're starting to see mobility services such as ride-hailing, as Uber and Lyft and Didi are providing. And these services are offered through vehicles that are owned by individuals. These companies, the ride-hailing companies, essentially manage these collections of vehicles. They are the intermediary again. But in order to fully capitalize on the benefits of ACE vehicles, of autonomous, connected, electrified vehicles, I feel that these mobility services will need to shift from being transportation network services, as they're called today, to being fleet operating companies. And the analogy that I can think of there is what's happening in the airlines, right? In other words, you have airlines manage fleets of airplanes, and through those fleets, they're able to, because they manage those fleets, they have two advantages. They can better control the price, the pricing of the service, and they also better control the user experience. So I think that these three shifts will need to take place in order for us to really start realizing the benefits of this technology, of this ACE set of technologies. And data, as I said, is the glue that brings everything together.
You touched on quite a few interesting points there. And on operating a fleet, I was in Singapore last week, and it's not exactly what you're talking about, but what Uber does there, because the cost of car ownership in Singapore with the government taxes is so high. You know, a Toyota Corolla can cost you about $100,000. What they do, Uber basically has a fleet of cars that it rents out to its drivers. So pretty much 90% of the cars I got into were just rented out by the drivers. So as towing that line between having a fleet but providing the access as well, which was interesting, I found, because in Australia and I think in most of the US, it's very much people driving their own cars as part of the Uber or Lyft networks.
Right. But what is also very important here is that still, and we see this with taxi companies, particularly in cities like New York, the driver is still responsible for that good or bad experience. And that's why services such as Uber have a driver rating system. Now, the existence of this system is very important and has definitely improved the overall transportation experience for consumers. But still, it cannot be uniform, and because the drivers do not work for the transportation network company, they're independent operators. And the same thing happens, obviously, and even more so in places like the United States, where the driver is not only is bringing the car in addition to their own behavior to that whole experience. So that is why I believe that the ACE vehicles, to the extent possible, they will enable these corporations, these companies, to better unify their experience, in addition to better control their costs.
Yeah, and when you say ACE vehicles, you're referring to autonomous vehicles, just for our audience.
Yes, they're autonomous, connected, electrified.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier that paradigm shift from moving, say, away from ownership towards accessibility, which obviously requires a behavioral sort of change. A lot of people still like the idea of, buying a car, driving that car. It's been a very sort of aspirational goal for a lot of Americans in particular. And that's, I suppose, one of the things that may slow the adoption of autonomous vehicles, along with things like the ecosystem, charging stations being readily available across the board, and of course things like regulations. So how do you see things like behavior, the infrastructure network, and regulation playing a part when it comes to the adoption of autonomous vehicles?
Yeah, these are all excellent points, and so let's start from the top. The reason that I talk about a hybrid model as opposed to an outright model where car ownership is a thing of the past is because I don't believe that for the foreseeable future, maybe the next 20 years, let's say, we will give up car ownership. The question is going to be whether we can slow down or we can change our definition of car ownership, right? So today, again, in many developed economies and in certain developing economies, the idea of two-car families either has taken hold or is taking hold. And if we succeed with the model of combining car ownership with car access, I believe that we will be able to do with only one car as opposed to feeling that we need two cars. And that is going to have an important impact, because if you think that if you eliminate that one car, and if that car is also electrified, now you're starting to have a significant impact on the environment and on climate change and all these other points that I mentioned before. Going back to your second point. Again, several people have asked me how quickly does this thing become, does this type of technology become adopted? And the problem with ACE vehicles is not going to be technology. I firmly believe that over the next 5 or so years, we will have at least level 4 autonomy, if not level 5 autonomy. And just for your listeners, level 4 is where we have a fully autonomous car, but we still have a driver behind the wheel in case something happens and the driver wants to take over, or because the driver wants to drive the car on a manual basis. Level 5 autonomy is the truly driverless car, where the vehicle may not even have a steering wheel. So these are for your listeners, if you look at the so-called Google bubble cars, the small pod-like vehicles, the inside of those vehicles essentially have a bench that accommodates 2 passengers, but they do not have a steering wheel. So again, the technology will get us to level 4, I think, over the next 5-6 years. It's called 5 years, and we'll have the ability to go from experimentation to adoption. The problem, though, is going to be both regulation and the cost of adopting infrastructures, city infrastructures, more general transportation infrastructures, to a world that can accommodate both let's call them regular vehicles, as well as driverless vehicles or autonomous vehicles. And this is why, again, I'm more and more convinced that the initial broader users of these vehicles, of these ACE vehicles, are going to be fleets, and they're going to be fleets in certain urban environments as opposed to just unfettered adoption.
Yeah, so predominantly in urban environments where travel times are relatively short, because I understand the Tesla vehicle, I think the Model S, its average sort of range is about 250 to 300 kilometers, if I'm not mistaken, before it requires a full charge. So it doesn't really lend itself to, like you said, outside of urban area travel.
Right, and I also think that in those areas we can map them more precisely, and as I mentioned in the book, having this kind of vehicles is not only the technology that makes up the vehicle, but is with regards to infrastructure, we need to rely on much more sophisticated maps than we have access to today, either on our phones or in our vehicles.
Yeah, well, so having a fleet, does that also, I suppose, mitigate some of the challenges around, say, the number of ACE vehicles on our roads being very high? Because at the moment you have the odd charging station here and there, but the percentage of people that have electric cars is still very low. But what happens when that number balloons out to tens of, if not hundreds of thousands of cars? I know Tesla's talking about having a battery replacement station where you just drive over the top of it and your battery gets replaced and away you go. So do you see that the fleet approach will mitigate some of that challenge?
It will, and actually this is another good example of where data plays a big role. I think that in terms of how, through the right analytics, and the usage that the car will need to execute during the course of the day, you will be able to determine how frequently you need to charge the car, where you need to charge the car, in which cars you need to take out of circulation in order to charge them and maintain them, and which ones you need to have going around. I mean, again, very much like airlines do with their fleets. And as you said, I believe that you will be able to have a much better control as we become more accustomed to that type of technology and more importantly, that type of mobility service.
Yeah, and on data in autonomous vehicles, there's no limit to the amount of data that can be generated. I mean, the cars are equipped with things like sensors, cameras, LiDAR, GPS, actuators, obviously the engine, the infotainment system. There's lots of different things going on in the vehicle. And as your book alludes to, it generates navigation data, vehicle health data, so you know when to upgrade it, when to get it serviced, traffic data, real-time traffic updates, driver and passenger profiles, predicting other driver behavior in the vicinity, which is an interesting one. So, I mean, with all of this data, what are some of the applications that, say, startups or incumbent companies in the automotive industry can begin to explore? Yeah,
so to date, a lot of the concern has been around navigation, and because it's important, obviously, if you have an autonomous car, for it to behave properly on the road, to recognize the right obstacles and operate under any weather condition, which has been one of the important challenges. Now, as we see more of these vehicles on the road, and especially when you have these hybrid environments of this type of vehicles with more conventional vehicles, the proper operation under the right conditions will become even more challenging. But on top of for me, the big opportunity is, as I said earlier, is in providing these transportation experiences. So let's take an example. If I were to drive from Silicon Valley to have meetings in San Francisco, what I do is either I will take my car and drive to San Francisco, or maybe I will take a ride-hailing service, or maybe the train. But I think of this in a very siloed manner. Imagine a situation where I can my car manufacturer, because they know my schedule, because I have given them access to that data. They can tell me in the morning, well, look, we know that you have to go to San Francisco, but rather than driving all the way to San Francisco, you can drive to, let's say, the airport, which is about 6 or so miles from San Francisco. And from there, you can park the car. And here's, by the way, the right garage to park, and here's an offer for that garage, and we'll get to the aspect of what makes right garage in a minute. Mm-hmm. And then you can take BART, which is the subway system in San Francisco, and when you should get off at that place, and from there we'll have an Uber or a Lyft vehicle waiting for you to take it to your first meeting, and et cetera and so forth. So here we can use data to not only deal with this multimodal transportation experience, which is very important, right, as opposed to seeing it as a siloed experience, but we can go beyond that. So as I said, what constitutes a good garage? Well, in San Francisco, safety could be one important consideration, but weather may not be, right, because we have a very temperate climate. On the other hand, if you were having the same experience in February in New York City, weather would be an important consideration in terms of what constitutes a good garage to park your car in. So then when you are at your destination, being able to make choices of when do I take public transportation versus a ride-hailing service. Again, these are all applications that rely on data analysis. While you are in the vehicle, you talked about personalizing your entertainment, and personalization if you're driving alone is very different than personalization if you're driving, let's say, with your children or with your spouse. So again, developing this type of applications is important. Another, with regards to safety, by using cameras inside the vehicle and understanding maybe the mood or even the physical condition of the passenger, tiredness, sleepiness, whatever, the cabin of the vehicle can be properly tailored, right? Remember, you're not driving in an autonomous vehicle, so whether it is the temperature of the vehicle, whether it is again the entertainment choices or the information that is provided to you, the way that this information is provided, is it going to be visual, is it going to be audio? All of this customization and personalization can happen on the fly through the use of big data applications.
Yeah, so there's obviously a lot of different applications, but one that I guess is particularly interesting is that on remote upgrades to the vehicles based on driver data, which effectively makes the cars safer. I know Tesla does this with its vehicles, where similar to an iPhone, you get your software upgrades, and those upgrades are based on user data. Any bugs are reported back, and then those bugs are fixed, and then they come out and solve the problem in the next upgrade, right? So currently in the US, there are 30,000 fatalities a year. So my concern, or not necessarily concern, but it seems that a lot of people think that self-driving cars won't be safe. But there's enough data out there to say that self-driving cars or ACE vehicles are actually much safer than human beings. However, human beings are not the most rational of creatures. And so when an accident happens and say somebody gets killed on the side of the road because of an ace vehicle, that's far more likely to result in people being up in arms about it as opposed to a standard accident involving two human drivers. So what's your view on sort of the irrationality of human beings when it comes to this topic?
Yeah. Well, you're bringing a much bigger issue, I think, that goes even beyond vehicles, and that is the use of automation in our everyday lives. As I work with large corporations from a variety of industries that are participating in the transportation value chain, including companies that provide financing, vehicle financing, companies that provide insurance. I can tell you that there is a lot of analysis and a lot of discussion that is going on with regards to the impact that these vehicles will have in everything from how the financing is impacted to how insurance is impacted, to how ethics are impacted. And we are, at least here in the United States, we are very familiar with the various idiosyncrasies of driving idiosyncrasies from city to city. So how I drive in San Francisco is very different from how I drive in Boston or in New York or in Dallas. And my thinking has been that if we're going to aspire to have these fully automated vehicles or other fully automated devices, we will need to find a way to start reflecting these idiosyncrasies in the way that these cars behave, especially because, as I said in the beginning, we will have this hybrid world. So I think what you're bringing up is that we'll have to both analyze and study how these technologies impact our existing norms, how we finance assets, how we insure, as well as how they impact our behaviors and ethics. And again, I'm not smart enough, I think, to explore all of these implications, but I can tell you that there are a lot of people that are working on this and thinking about all of these problems because they see the automation as an inevitable progression.
Yeah, and I think you touched on a great point there because we were having a conversation in the office the other day about how in urban areas people are quite inclined to jaywalk and not simply wait for the little pedestrian sign to go green, right? And if, say, an autonomous vehicle is just basing it on the traffic sign, it will go when someone's, say, running across the road. So I guess this ties into what you were saying there about being conscious of not just different driving behaviors in across the United States, but also pedestrian behaviors, some of the subtle things that human beings do when they make eye contact and before, say, crossing the road, just to show the driver that you're there and your intentions are that you're crossing the road and that they should wait for you. So there's a lot of subtleties, idiosyncrasies, and nuances, I suppose, that the people that you mentioned that are working on these problems just need to be wary of.
Yeah, and this is why, by the way, I've said that it will still take us a few years to even have the technology out because, again, even though we have test vehicles, autonomous vehicles on the road today, I mean, again, the experiments that companies like Google and even Tesla have been doing and other companies are pretty well documented. These are just tests, and there's a lot of debugging, if you will, that still needs to go on, and a lot of the debugging is not done in order to deal with how the vehicle behaves where everything is perfect. The weather conditions are perfect, the road conditions are perfect, but what happens when we have these unexpected cases, these corner cases, if you can call them, that can make a lot of times maybe the difference between life and death.
Yeah, couldn't agree more on that. And just wanted to sidestep over to 4 companies that you've identified that are at the core of the ACE vehicle movement, being Tesla, Uber, Google, and Zipcar. And it was interesting to note that some of the traits that these companies share, which you've outlined in your book, is that they're direct to consumer, which you mentioned earlier is something that automotive companies need to be thinking about, and that's something that obviously Tesla is doing, and that way they have access to more customer data. The companies are data-driven, they're venture-backed, and more importantly, they experiment constantly. They get out there, they make decisions with incomplete data, with uncertainty, they hire the best talent, and they're organized in small teams that move fast, take risks, and break rules. So it sounds like you've basically described your typical 5-person Silicon Valley startup there.
Well, so first, just to make a clarification, I consider these companies not disruptors for ACE vehicles. I said these are disruptors in next generation mobility. Okay. Because if you look at, for example, Zipcar does not have ACE vehicles, at least not that I know of. Mm-hmm. And in the case of Uber, they are experimenting obviously with ACE vehicles, but or with autonomous vehicles as well as partnering with companies. But to me, what is important, and again, it touches upon a couple of the points that you've made before, which is this is not just an incremental improvement over innovations that have been made in the past. This is a fundamental disruption in the way that we move, mm-hmm. we transport ourselves. And so it is important for corporations that want, particularly incumbents, that want to participate in this new reality, mm-hmm. that they understand what are the characteristics of the companies that at least I consider disruptors in the space. I mean, certainly Uber is no longer a startup. Tesla is a public company. Zipcar is owned by Avis, which is a public company. So these companies are no longer, startups by any means. Mm. There are hundreds of startups here in the Valley, in Israel, in China, and many other parts, Europe, many other parts of the world that are working and contributing in this next generation mobility, whether it is as technology or services. But the important point to make is that all of these companies, small or large, have certain common characteristics, which I think are extremely important for incumbents to understand, so that they can be effective in this transition if they decide to take it.
And with the technology moving so quickly, the incumbents will have no choice but to adopt some of these characteristics if they are to compete and if they are to survive. And they're facing challenges like short-termism runs rife in a lot of large companies, challenges around processes, systems, and values that are all geared towards a short term, all geared towards let's grow revenue by 5% this year, all geared towards business cases where we make decisions based on conditions of absolute certainty, middle management resistance. So there's a lot of challenges that incumbents will face to start adopting some of these characteristics. And I know that's where you say setting up innovation outposts is something that large incumbents can start to think about.
Yeah, this is where my broader work on startup-driven innovation is woven into this book, because I think it is important for corporations, as I said, particularly incumbents that want to participate in this disruption, to understand what it will take and how to best take advantage of startup ecosystems such as Silicon Valley's or other ecosystems around the world.
And you've got a section in your book where you talk about automakers rethinking innovation, and that internal research and development isn't enough. Can you elaborate on that for our audience?
Yes. The good news is that I feel that particularly OEMs or automakers are starting to realize, as we've been discussing today, that technology is one aspect, but there are many other aspects that need to be addressed. Business models. So if you talk about mobility services, if there is you have automakers like BMW, Daimler, GM, Ford that are starting to offer now their own mobility services, sometimes completely on their own, sometimes in partnership with mobility services companies like Uber and Lyft. Like in the case of GM, for example, they partnered with Lyft and they made a big investment in Lyft. Mm-hmm. So I feel that they are starting to understand that it's not only about technology. It's not only about automotive technology, and this is again where the data plays a big role, and this is where they need to beef up their capabilities. But they are starting to take these steps, and we see them. We see that particularly here in Silicon Valley.
And that brings me to the 5 recommendations you've got for disrupting with big data. Very much lends itself to larger incumbents partnering with smaller, faster-moving organizations and, say, using their scale, using the scale of an organization like GM as an advantage and augmenting their research and development efforts with Horizon 3 or disruptive innovation models where we're looking at more sort of breakthrough business models. And while they're more risky, we need to be adopting systems to help us explore that Horizon 3 innovation. Otherwise, we will find ourselves simply skating to where the puck is or staying stagnant rather than skating to where the puck will be, and where I suppose companies taking advantage of ACE vehicles and actually capitalizing on this change will be.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I feel that there need, both in the case of incumbents and in the case of startups, there needs to be a very good understanding of how they can not only collaborate, but more importantly, how they can exchange value. I think incumbents need to appreciate the shifts that we talked about, the shifts that are being brought by this technology in combination with the mobility services. They need to understand that they're no longer just in the manufacturing business, design and manufacturing, but they need to get into this customer insights business in order to provide these transportation experiences, transportation solutions I have been talking about. They need to develop that data sharing culture because while they may start recognizing the importance of data, they must also recognize that they will not be able to own all the necessary data. Just in the example that I mentioned earlier in our conversation, I hope I gave to the audience a good indication of how many different pieces and types of data need to come together in order to be able to provide these superior experiences. And finally, they need, as you said, to adopt a new innovation model. Now, on the flip side, startups, regardless of how disruptive they can be or they are, they need to appreciate that they need to be part of a value chain. And in order to be part of a value chain, they need to be able to determine and articulate what is the role of this value chain, what is the value that they bring. Big data offers big opportunities, as we said, but just being data-centric, as many startups obviously are today, is not enough. You need to be able to recognize what the other members of this value chain are bringing to this new reality, to this new environment that is being created through the combination of ACE vehicles and mobility services.
And I think the broader lesson there, just for organizations going forward is that we are moving towards a more collaborative, interconnected world where companies that work together and leverage their respective roles in the value chain are far more likely to succeed than companies that think they can just go it alone.
Yeah, I call that corporate interfaceability. Corporations need to be able to be agile and be able to dynamically, a lot of times, form these value chains that will not be set in stone in the same way that the automotive value chain has remained largely unchanged over the past several decades. I think in the reality that in the world that we're moving to, even if my predictions of the models that I am advocating do not fully come to fruition, I can guarantee you that it's going to be a completely new reality than we have today, and that will require, as I said, a corporate interfaceability that starts from open APIs, if you want to think of the information technology, but it also continues to the right business processes, the right people, and obviously the right culture.
Yep. So people, processes, and culture, one for our audience there. We've come to the end of the formal part of the program, Evangelos, but given that you have appeared on the program before, I can't simply just ask you our normal 3 questions as part of our lightning round. So I've come up with 3 new hypotheticals, all about ACE vehicles. Are you ready to rock and roll?
Okay.
Let's do it. So question number 1 is Tesla Model X or Model S?
Model S.
Why the Model S?
I think that less complexity, and there are enough things to address with the software technology, which is I think Tesla has done a very good job, but there's still a lot to be done. So you don't need the extra complexity of the gullwing doors.
Fair enough. And question number 2, given that ACE vehicles may eventually do away with the interior of a car as we know it, what would you have in your custom Evangelos Simoudis ACE vehicle?
Definitely a superior entertainment system. And I will have 4 very comfortable seats that are very, very articulated and very customizable to the shape of the passenger.
Perfect. Love it. And finally, if you could augment yourself with artificial intelligence and robotics, would you do it?
I wouldn't. I appreciate very much the help that these systems can provide, but I don't think that, barring any unforeseen accidents or situations that go beyond the normal existence, I wouldn't do it.
Fair enough, Evangelos. Well, look, you've left our audience once again with a lot of value, but I do highly recommend that they rush out to Amazon and pick up a copy of the Big Data Opportunity in Our Driverless Future. You don't necessarily need to be an automotive executive to get a lot of value out of this book when it comes to the mindset, the methods, tools, the way you need to be thinking to be taking advantage of a lot of the imminent technology change in business. So head on to Amazon to check that out. Is there anywhere else people should go to find out a bit more about yourself and connect, Evangelos?
So my blog site is corporateinnovation.co. My investment firm is synapsepartners.co.
Thank you again, Evangelos. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Hey guys, it's Steve again. If you're picking up what we're putting down, we'd love it if you took just a minute of your time to like, share, or subscribe to Future Squared on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Stitcher. It would mean a hell of a lot to the team here who work effortlessly to bring you thought leaders and experts on topics of corporate innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-improvement on a weekly basis. As always, you can find more resources on innovation, including blogs, books, podcasts, videos, webinars, and tools at www.collectivecamp.us. If you'd like to connect with me on Twitter, you can do so at Steve Glaveski. That's Glaveski. Until next time, keep innovating. Future Squared out.